Hi everyone! Today's video is going to talk a little bit about how to model or draw pictures of decimal multiplication. And we're going to start with some examples where we multiply decimals by whole numbers. And we can show this type of multiplication a couple different ways. The first is to use a number line. So I have my example 4 times 4 tenths, and I chose this example for the number line strategy because the number line strategy works best when the decimal ends in the tenths place. That's because we're actually going to be drawing a number line and counting up by our decimal number. The whole number factor will tell us how many sets or how many times we need to count. So in this case, that means I'm going to have 4 groups of 4 tenths. So if I draw my number line, I'll start at 0. I'm going to start by drawing one set of 4 tenths. This first amount here is representing 4 tenths, and since I started at 0, that means my solid green line, which ends that first group, is at 0 and 4 tenths. Then I'll draw another group of 4 tenths. Since I started at 4 tenths this time, that means I'm ending now at 0 and 8 tenths. A third set of 4 tenths will bring me to 1 and 2 tenths. And finally, the fourth set of 4 tenths will bring me to my final answer of 1 and 6 tenths. So you can probably see why this strategy works best when you're dealing with tenths place numbers. But you've probably guessed by now that you won't always be dealing with tenths place numbers, so let's take a look at a second strategy. This is to use base 10 blocks. So I've changed my problem slightly. This time I want to multiply 4 times 41/100ths. And I chose the base 10 blocks for this example because base 10 blocks work really well for decimals that end in the tenths or the hundredths place. So the whole number part, again, is going to tell us how many groups we have, and then the decimal value will tell us how many blocks go in each group. So in 4 times 41/100ths, I have 4 total groups. And in each of those groups, I have 41/100ths, which I can show with 4 tenths rods and 1 cube. So I'll make all 4 of my groups the same. Now, if I actually had these blocks in front of me, I would combine pieces and trade them in. So to show that, I need to show that I can group together 10 of these tenths rods into one flat. Then I still have 6 tenths rods left over, and finally my 4 hundredths cubes. So that can model that my multiplication problem 4 times 41/100ths is equal to 1 and 64/100ths. Let's take a look at one more whole number by decimal strategy, and that's to shade in grids. This is another strategy that works best for decimals that end in tenths and hundredths. So I'm going to still use the question 4 times 41/100ths as our example. And again, the whole number is going to tell us how many groups we need to shade in, and the decimal factor tells us how big each group should be. So in this particular example, I have 4 groups of 41/100ths. So my first group of 41/100ths I can show by shading in 4 long rows and 1 small cube. Now for the next group of 41/100ths, the part about this that gets a little tricky is that 1/10 is actually these 9 pieces below the green here and one more at the top. So that means to show another group of 41/100ths, I need 1/10, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths gets me to 40/100ths, and then one more cube for 41/100ths. So now in my third group, in order to make a tenth, I need these 8 blocks and then 2 more. So I have 1/10, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, that shows 40/100ths, and one more cube for 41. And finally, for my last group of 41/100ths, to show a tenth, I need the 7 pieces below the pink and the 3 at the top right next to it. So I have 1/10, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, shows 40/100ths, and then one more block. If I looked at all of this, the part that's shaded in is equal to 1 whole, 6 tenths, and 4 more hundredths cubes, which matches my answer from the base 10 blocks of 1 and 64/100ths. Okay, let's take a look at one more type of decimal multiplication model, but this time we're going to model multiplying a decimal by a decimal. And again, we use a grid for this. Multiplying a decimal by a decimal is a way to show another new type of multiplication. This time, we're going to be showing when we can find a part of a part. So for example, if I have 0 and 4 tenths times 0 and 8 tenths, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about what I'm really saying. In this case, our problem is really saying that we're taking 4 tenths of a group of 8 tenths. That's how we know we're finding a part of a part, because we're taking a small piece less than 1 of something that's already less than 1. So let's show how we would model or draw a picture of this. First, I'm going to look at our second factor, which in this case is the 0 and 8 tenths, and I'll shade in that many pieces vertically. So that means if I have a grid, I'll shade in 8 tenths vertically or up and down. Then I need to find my first factor, which in this case is 4 tenths. I'll shade in that many pieces horizontally or side to side. So now on a grid, that means I would shade in 4 tenths side to side. Finally, I'm going to overlap those two grids. And where you see the squares that overlap is going to show your final answer. So if I have a grid, it's going to show that they're overlapping, and that part that turned green will show my answer. If I were to count all of these tiny little cubes, there would be 32 small hundredths cubes. That tells me my product will be 0 and 32 hundredths. So those are the main ways that we'll be modeling decimal multiplication, both when we're multiplying a decimal by a whole number and a decimal by a decimal.